Und jetzt begrüßen wir ganz herzlich Dr. Patrick Moore.
I'm so proud to be a member of your NGO because your principles are mine.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. And good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for being only English speaking. It's one of the curses of this world to have English as your first language because it becomes very difficult to get a second one this way, as everyone else is speaking English to me. In Mexico, when I get in a taxi, the taxi driver practices English on me while I try to practice Spanish on him. So anyway, I have made all subtitles in German with the help of Uwe Schrader. So hopefully, even if I say words which you don't understand, you will see from the subtitles what I'm trying to talk about. My main theme is 3 points. First, there is no science proof that human emissions of CO2 have caused any of the slight warming which has occurred since the last 300 years, since the death of the Little Ice Age. There is no proof that this is not a completely natural situation. It may be that CO2 has caused a little bit of the warming, but there is no proof of any kind how much, if any. Secondly, there is absolute certain proof that increasing CO2 is causing the forests and the crops and the plants in general to grow faster all around the world. First, because CO2 is necessary for the plants and they are starving at low levels. And second, because CO2 makes plants more efficient with water and now they can grow in dry places where they couldn't grow before.
Exactly.
So this is the fact that additional CO2, even doubling from now, will be entirely beneficial. There will be no negative effect, and a big positive effect. Third point, basing energy policy on the fake story of CO2 causing catastrophic warming is a terrible mistake, and Germany is like a big ship headed for a big rock with the Energiewende. And this is what I'm going to show you. Here's where I'm born. Thankfully, the clouds came. And this was my house until I was 14 years old. My mother and my father owned this village. He was a logger, and he cut the trees around here. Still, there are millions of trees around there. But I grew up in nature. I played in these forests. Eventually, this village went onto the beach here. The trees were cleared and the houses were taken ashore. Not until 1965 did a road come here. Everything was from boats. When the road came, we thought the place would explode in population. Half the people used the road to get out. I went to university at British Columbia University in Vancouver, doing my PhD in ecology in the middle of the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the threat of all nuclear war, and the emerging consciousness of the environment in the late 1960s. This turned me to a radical environmental activist. I joined a small group in a church basement, and we sailed a boat to Alaska to protest US hydrogen bomb testing there. We proved that a small group of people with strong conviction could change history, or help at least. President Nixon canceled the remaining nuclear tests, and that was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. Here, coming home from Alaska, we are welcomed to the big house of the Namgis Nation at Alert Bay near my northern Vancouver Island home to make them us brothers of their tribe, because they agreed with what we've done. Here we learned the story of the warriors of the rainbow, an Indian legend that says one day when the skies are black and the birds fall dead and the waters are poisoned, people around the earth will join together to save the planet. We named our ship Rainbow Warrior, and I spent the next 15 years full-time around the world campaigning for the environment. Next, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. They were still blowing up atomic and hydrogen bombs in the air, in the early 1970s, sending radiation around the world. They were more difficult. It took some years to make these tests go underground at Mururoa Atoll, but as late as 1985, under President Mitterrand's direct orders, French commandos bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in New Zealand, killing our photographer. Going back 10 years to 1975, this was the campaign that made Greenpeace famous around the world, to save the whales. Here we are, first encounter with the Soviet factory whaling fleet in the North Pacific. We confronted the whalers. There you can see the dead whales. They will go up this hole and be cut in the deck. We put ourselves in front of their harpoons in our little boats, 1,000 miles from land, to save the whales, which were fleeing away. And we did do some saving of a few whales that way, but this was on television then everywhere in the world. And only 4 years later, factory whaling was banned in the North Pacific, and by 1981 in all the world's oceans. Why did I leave Greenpeace after 15 years on the front lines? We drifted slowly from Greenpeace to just green. The peace part of Greenpeace is about preventing nuclear war and saving civilization from destruction. In other words, we care about the people too. So we had a strong humanitarian orientation in the early years. But as we went, save the whales, save the seals, toxic waste, and all the other things, many people in the environmental movement began to think that human beings are the enemies of nature. That we are the bad species on the earth. Like as if all other species are good and only humans are bad. For me, this is too much like original sin in religion. And indeed, the Green Movement has become a kind of religion based on belief, not on observation or replication like science is based, but on something in your head, which you cannot see. I've just written a small essay titled, The Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. And if you think carbon dioxide is invisible, the coral reefs which are dying in the world, nobody can go and see if it's happening or not. They just write it in the newspaper. The GMO, what is in the GMO that is bad? Whatever it is, it's invisible. Pesticide residues in food. It's been proven by the cancer people that this is no problem, and many other scientists. But it's invisible, so they make you scared that something is in the food which is going to harm you. The 300-mile sea of plastic in the waste in the Pacific Ocean, right, way far from you. You can't go see whether there is a sea of plastic in the ocean. Have you ever seen a picture of it, though? No, you haven't, because it does not exist. It is made up, and they make drawings of it on the internet. Just go see a plastic Pacific Ocean and look for images on the computer, and you will not see a single image. You see a bunch of fake stuff with birds that have opened their stomach, and then they put pieces of plastic. You can see they put it there. They put these plastic things inside the bird's stomach and then take a picture of it. The reason birds and fish eat plastic is because of the food growing on it. Just like a piece of wood will have seaweed and barnacles and crabs and things using it to grow on. All these sea creatures also can use plastic to grow on, which is totally non-toxic. But I digress. Anyways, that's why I left Greenpeace, because they make up all these stories. And the climate story is one of them. And CO2 is also invisible, as I mentioned. There is no doubt that human being emissions of carbon dioxide are responsible for the increase in CO2 in the global atmosphere. Beginning in 1959, in Hawaii, they started to measure it. So I do not question this. I think it's true. I also think it's good, but they think it's bad. Here's what NASA says. Carbon dioxide controls Earth's temperature. Straight out statement that CO2 is the factor that controls the Earth's temperature. I say no credible or legitimate scientist would ever say such a thing, because there are so many other things controlling the Earth's temperature. To make a statement basically saying CO2 controls the Earth's temperature, you're basically saying only CO2 controls the Earth's temperature, nothing else. So this is a lie. The fact that NASA receives $1.6 billion a year in climate research money from the US federal government has a lot to do with this. If they don't say this, then why would they give them the money? And here are the people celebrating the Paris Agreement, or the Paris non-agreement, in Paris in 2016. I was present there, made some presentations at some alternative conferences. But basically, this is just political show. There is absolutely no substance to this in reality. And in particular, China, India must do nothing, even though they are the big emitters. And the Green Movement, they're not just predicting that there's going to be a climate catastrophe. They are telling us it's already here. That everything bad that is happening is because of human CO2 emissions. All the storms, all the floods, all the droughts, all the hurricanes, everything bad is because of it. Even now they are saying volcanoes and earthquakes are because of climate change. So it's just gone completely crazy. Now, when I say there's no proof that humans are the main cause of climate change, let's just go back to 500 million years ago. A little more, 570. This purple line is global CO2 levels. The blue line is global temperature. There is almost no correlation between the two for this huge period of history. Even here they are opposite each other. This goes down, this goes up, this goes down, this goes up. And keeps going up to here, the Eocene thermal maximum. Here they are in concert with each other, falling down together. But then temperature goes up when CO2 does not, for 100 million years. That's a long time for CO2 to fail to control the Earth's temperature. This is, and take note of the fact, this is the Pleistocene Ice Age, which we are in now, the interglacial periods, this one being the one we're in now, and the glacial periods. Note that we are in one of the coldest periods in the history of the Earth, cold as it was 290 million years ago. Since then, it has always been warmer. And note that we are in the lowest period of CO2 levels in the history of the Earth. And they are telling us CO2 is too high and temperature is too high. Now here is something where there is a strong correlation. Ice cream consumption and shark attacks. They are almost perfectly correlated. And this is why you must never say that correlation equals causation. This is not a good way of saying this. This isn't my graph. So I think this word must be put there. Correlation can be causation, but it is not necessarily causation. And here's a case where it is not causation, because there is a common factor underlying these trends which creates them, and that is temperature. In the summer, when it's warm, people go swimming and come out and have an ice cream. That is why they are correlated so strongly. But as you can see, temperature and carbon dioxide through the ages of the Earth are not hardly even slightly correlated. So this would indicate no causal relationship. That was what it would indicate. We are at the end today, this is the Pleistocene Ice Age right here. We are at the end of a 50 million year cooling period in the Earth's climate. This is when the dinosaurs went extinct, 65 million years ago. From then, it continued to get warmer to the Eocene thermal maximum. In this period, the Earth was entirely free of ice. There was no permanent ice anywhere on the Earth until the Antarctic began to freeze over. Now, the Antarctic freezes over sooner than the Arctic because it is a small bunch of island continents in the middle of the South Pole surrounded by nothing but water. So it's a totally different situation than the North Pole, which is a small sea surrounded entirely by land. And land heats up easier than water. And so the northern hemisphere is always warmer than the southern hemisphere. And that's why the southern hemisphere began to freeze sooner, 35 million years ago, and then it got warmer again, and there was some partial deglaciation of the Antarctic, and then down to the depths of the Pleistocene Ice Age, the first ice age in 250 million years. There were others before that. But this is where we are now. And this is the last 400,000 years. Now, most of the long-term records are from marine sediment cores. They can go down 100 million, 200 million years or more in marine sediment cores. This is from ice cores from Antarctic, the Vostok ice cores, and also the joint EU, maybe it's Japan, anyways, there's an EU set of cores that goes back 800,000 years. But this is the most striking, the last 400,000. Here you can see these are the interglacial periods, and here's the one we're in now. And here are the depths of the ice ages, down here. You can see you go slowly into the ice age and quickly out of it, like teeth on a saw. Down and up, and now we are going down again. That is the big, almost laugh about this global warming scare. Yes, we are in one of the little warming periods that occurs in blips every 500 years or so. Well, the warming periods are 1,000 years. 500 years of cooling, 500 years of warming, that kind of thing. Since the Roman warm period, even since the Minoan warm period. I'll show you that soon. Now you can see here that this is the fraud of Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. He said, look, CO2 and temperature are perfectly correlated. Therefore, CO2 must be causing the temperature to go up and down. But it turns out that the CO2 is 800 years lagging the temperature. The cause never comes after the effect. The cause comes before the effect. And in this case, the temperature comes before the CO2. I'll show you a graph where it's much clearer where this is spread out, because this is really compressed. This is 400,000 years. And so, what's really causing the CO2 and the temperature to be in conjunction with each other is that when the climate warms, warm seawater holds less gas than cold seawater. So when the climate warms, the ocean breathes out CO2, oxygen, and all the other gases which are in it. If you take a glass of water from the refrigerator and put it on the counter, you will see the bubbles form inside the water as the water warms up. That's the gas coming out. If you put that glass back into the fridge again, it will absorb CO2 in the fridge and oxygen in the fridge and come back up to a higher level. But you can't see that happening because it's going into the water and becoming dissolved, so you can't see it. But that's what's happening here. This is according to the Milankovitch cycles. I could give you a whole hour talk on the Milankovitch cycles, but of course I won't. But if you want to look them up, it's easy. The Wikipedia entry on Milankovitch cycles is excellent. This was discovered in the 1930s to 1940s. The Milankovitch cycles are variations in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of the Earth and the wobble of the tilt and a couple of other things. But they are 20,000, 40,000, and 100,000 year cycles. And this is based on the 100,000 year cycle here, these peaks. So this is the last 11,000 years. So we've come out of the Ice Age to here. Now this is typical. Again, if you look at this one, the peak temperature is always at the end of coming out, and then down, and then down. This one didn't last very long. Neither did this one. But these last two, this is the Eemium. This is the Holocene, what we call our present interglacial period. And this is the change in the orbit of the Earth, the tilt of the Earth. This is the Little Ice Age, which just happened 300 years ago. But note, this is the Holocene climatic optimum. This is when it was the warmest, up until 5,000 years ago, when suddenly it began to decline. This is the beginning of the 80,000 year descent into the next glacial period. Almost certainly. You can't prove it till it happens, of course. but it appears to have already started just like it did the last times. At the same time, CO2 has gone up while this cooling period has occurred. Again, demonstrating that they are not directly related to each other in a cause-effect relationship. And these are other gases, etc. This is methane. And here we are today, still far below the temperature of the climate maximum. And here is, I just found this graph. This is one of the most interesting. This is a paper that was published in Judith Curry's blog, and this shows, again, the Holocene climatic optimum and the neoglacial, just like here. The same person who did that graph did this graph. This shows the advancing glaciers. So during the Holocene climate optimum, there was very little glacial advance. This is in different latitudes and everything. It's all very well understood how glaciers have advanced and retreated through this period. And in the neoglacial, and then in the Little Ice Age, which is the coldest period that has occurred during the Holocene, the glaciers began to advance more. There's a monastery in Switzerland in a high valley, high mountain, Alps Valley, which was built around 900 AD. At that time, they were growing food there for the monastery because it was at the medieval warm period, which was here. So this was considered a warm period. Today, the monastery is still there, and they're still making good beer, but they're growing their food 1,000 meters lower in altitude. Now the ski lifts begin where the monastery is. So it was even warmer during the medieval warm period than it is now. This is the longest record of temperature in one place on the Earth with a thermometer, with an actual thermometer. Before that, we have to estimate the temperature by proxies, isotopes and things. Here, though, is the temperature record. Here is annual CO2 emissions. They just aren't connected in any obvious way, even in the recent history. It's just, this was obviously all natural up until at least 1890. This was natural. This is the coldest it ever got during the Little Ice Age. And it got colder again here. But it's just going up at a fairly regular, you see this increase here, this is no different than this increase here. We have a correlation right now because we're in the warming cycle, the short-term warming cycle. It's basically, it cycles on cycles on cycles on cycles. There's 100,000-year cycles, there's 1,000-year cycles, there's 160,000-year cycles. They're all overlapping each other and creating waves through time. But there is no reason to believe that CO2 has anything to do with that temperature. This is the work by Willie Soon and his associates in Ireland, the Connollys, and they have demonstrated very clearly by only using rural weather stations in China, in America, and in Europe, that the relationship, this is the correlation value, and this is the correlation value. Temperature is much more closely correlated to solar variation, total solar irradiation, than it is to CO2. In other words, as they say, it's the sun, stupid. Here are the models that our energy policy is being based on. Here's the observations from balloons and satellites, real measurements, not satellite predictions. They can predict the past quite well, because they go in and they move the numbers around in the model so it mimics the past to make them look smarter. The real problem with me is that because I do not claim to be able to predict the future of the world's climate, only to say this looks like what's happening, etc., from the graphs of real data, it makes me look stupid compared to the people who say they can predict the future of the climate. Because they're smarter, obviously, than me if I can't predict the future. But the truth is, you can't predict a horse race, and you can't predict a baseball game, And you can predict the weather 3 weeks in the future with any accuracy. And they're saying they can predict the global climate in 50 years or 100 years. That is completely ridiculous. A computer model is not a crystal ball. Well, actually, the crystal ball is not a crystal ball either. It's a mythical object, right? Just like the Holy Grail or something. These are mythical things. They're made up. They're stories. There's no evidence they exist. And yet, they act as though this is a crystal ball, and your government and many other governments in the world are acting as though they have a crystal ball to predict the future. This is the thickness of ice at the height of the last glaciation 21,000 years ago. Remember, when someone says the Ice Age ended 20,000 years ago, that was not the end of the Ice Age. It was the end of one of many glaciations that have occurred during the Pleistocene Ice Age, which is 2.5 million years old. Some say 2.6. It's kind of splitting hairs as to when it actually started. But it's about that old, and it has these cycles. For the first 1.5 million years, it was a 40,000 year cycle, following one of the cycles of the Milankovitch series. And then suddenly it shifted. It's called the Pleistocene conundrum. Suddenly it shifted to a 100,000 year cycle, which is the cycle to do with the orbit. Whereas the 40,000 year cycle is the cycle, I believe, something to do with the tilt of the Earth. It just shifted. But these cycles are on cycles, so they come into harmony with each other sometimes, and sometimes they're out of harmony with each other. Oh, anyways, the point is there was over 3 kilometers of ice on top of what is now Montreal. And we didn't do that. And we didn't cause that ice to melt. It had nothing to do with us. But it happened. And that's somewhat more extreme than what has been happening over the last 500 years or so. This is where the ice sheets came, at the height of the last glaciation. So much more than today, even though there's still a lot of ice on the North Pole and Antarctic. It doesn't show Antarctic. It would have been way out into the sea. And this is the sea level rise. 420 feet, about nearly 120 meters since the glaciations began to melt. All of that water was on the land. It melted and went back into the sea and caused 420-foot rise in sea level. But the sea level rise really stopped at any amount 7,000 years ago. Now they're telling us the whole world will be flooded with sea level rise. Well, if you go to Indonesia or Palau or the Philippines, near the equator, you will see thousands of islands like this. These are made of stone in calm equatorial seas. And yet somehow the sea has carved into them, in some places 3 meters deep. If the sea was constantly rising, this could not happen. Just never. It takes thousands of years for this to happen. So my belief is that for the last 5,000 to 7,000 years, there have been ups and downs with the cooling and warming cycles, but there has been no net rise in sea level. And now we are having a slight rise in sea level. It's 1.3 to 1.6 millimeters per year. It is not accelerating, as the propagandists say it is. It simply isn't. We have pretty good measurements of tidal gauges going back 150 years all around the world. Some places the land is rising. Other places the land is sinking because of tectonic effects. But in general, there is very little sea level rise happening in the world, even today, with this so-called global warming. This is the energy of hurricanes in the world since 1972. There is no upward trend. It is basically no trend. Some years are more than others, and some years are less. And even the IPCC admits that there is no evidence of extreme weather events that they can attribute to CO2. Yet, the movement never stops talking about this. First they said it was global warming. Then when the warming stopped or slowed down, they said, oh no, now we'll call it climate change, so we can blame everything on CO2. We can blame the droughts and the floods and the tornadoes and the hurricanes and everything on CO2. Then, when it appeared maybe that wasn't really the case, then when someone said, oh, but it was a really cold winter last year, they would say, oh, no, that's not climate, that's weather. Right? That's just weather. Now, everything is about weather. The whole thing is about weather extremes. So every weather extreme is linked. And remember that, I don't know what word you use in German that is the equivalent of the word linked in English. But what it means is there's no proof that there's any connection at all. They just claim they're linked somehow, without having to prove any cause-effect relationship. They linked it, one to the other. They didn't have very good record keeping back here, but starting here in the 20s, you can see the deaths per year in thousands from extreme weather events, and the death rate per million people from extreme weather events. This is because of early warning, prediction of hurricanes, etc., and earthquakes even, and this is because of better infrastructure. When the Japanese earthquake hit and caused that tsunami that killed 15,000 or so people, nobody died from the earthquake. No building fell down in all of Japan. When an earthquake 20 times weaker hit Haiti in the Caribbean, 250,000 people died because they had bad concrete with not enough rebar. And they don't build their houses out of wood, they build them out of concrete, which is substandard construction, and it falls on their head. 250,000 people. It just proves that if we have good infrastructure and good warning systems, that we can drastically reduce the deaths from extreme weather. And here is the global losses to extreme weather downward trend, even though there's so much more infrastructure to lose now than there was in the earlier years. Now the most important part, because it's important to get this CO2 thing out of the way, because everything is based on CO2 being pollution. The whole thing, everything is based on CO2, nothing else. And so when the US government, EPA, declared that by law, carbon dioxide is a pollutant, in other words, it's basically toxic, that became the law. And that undermines all energy policy from then on, with regard to fossil fuels. The truth is, CO2 is the most important food for all of life. Water is just as important, but there's plenty of water, at least in most places. There is not plenty of CO2. I'll show you this. And I have a whole presentation on ocean acidification, as they call it, where they say if the CO2 goes up in the atmosphere, never mind the warming and the weather and everything else, it will dissolve in the ocean and kill all the shellfish, the corals, the coccolithophores, the foraminifera, all the shellfish. Their shells will dissolve because it will make the ocean more acidic. Actually, it will only make it slightly less basic. It won't make it acidic at all. And it won't kill that shellfish, because this shellfish and billions more like it, the ammonites, lived at 2,000 ppm before the dinosaur extinction and flourished in the seas everywhere. So did all the other shellfish, the crabs and the shrimps and all of those. They lived through 2,000 ppm. So ocean acidification is a complete fabrication and a complete lie. Whereas at least with global warming, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. That is a fact. So there's something to hang your hat on, so to speak, when you make this claim that CO2 is going to fry the Earth. It's not, but then that's where they start, with the fact that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Whereas with ocean acidification, there is no is. It just begins with a fake story. These are the shell animals and plants. These are beautiful coccolithophores. They're microscopic, they are plants, and they are the basis of the food chain in the sea, about 50%. the shellfish. The Foraminifera, or forams, as their specialists call them, is an animal with a calcium carbonate shell. All these shells are made of calcium carbonate. In the sea, the organism combines carbon from carbon dioxide with calcium dissolved in the sea from the weathering of stones on the earth. These holes are just the right size for one of these to go in. So these animals graze through the blooms of coccolithophores, eating them, turning them into this. And here are the coral reefs, which is also a great part of the massive amount of calcium carbonate that is produced in the sea every year from carbon dioxide. Here is where the carbon is. This is the human emissions. These are the back and forth of plants and soil and litter fall. Goes up in the fall when the plants lose their leaves and die, and comes down again when the plants grow in the spring. So that's what causes in that picture of CO2, all the little ups and downs as it's going up, is the fall and spring. This CO2 is new CO2. The CO2 that is cycling around is already in the atmosphere, and then goes down to the plants and back to the atmosphere and down to the plants, back to the atmosphere. But our CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and concrete production, cement production, they are new additions. They were buried in the ground for hundreds of millions of years. How did they get in the ground? The fossil fuels got in the ground from forests decomposing in anaerobic conditions, buried and turned to coal. And in the sea, the bodies of those foraminifera and coccolithophores and others went into sediments and turned into oil and gas. So that's where it's coming from, and it was buried a long time ago. How did it get into the ground? It came from the air. All of the CO2 we are emitting today was once in the atmosphere. That's the only origin of it. All of the CO2 that's in the ocean, 45 times as much CO2 is in the ocean than is in the atmosphere. 850 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere at 0.04% of the global atmosphere. Ocean uptake, ocean loss, these figures are guesses. Fossil fuels comprise approximately 5,000 to 10,000 billion tons of carbon. But look at this number. These are the carbonaceous rocks from the calcium carbonate that was created by marine calcifying organisms over the last 500 million years, which is when marine organisms learned to control the biomineralization of calcium carbonate to make protective armor for themselves. Now you'd think that would be a good idea, to make protective armor for yourself. It was a good idea, but what it did was it sucked most of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, continually dissolving into the ocean and being turned into calcium carbonate. That is where the carbon went from the atmosphere. Because I showed you earlier the slide that shows how high CO2 was millions of years ago. Here you can actually see, this is the last 50,000 years. Again, this is from the Vostok ice core. You can see that carbon dioxide follows behind temperature. First the temperature goes up, then the CO2 follows it. That is a fact. And they deny this even today. Some of them say, oh yes, at first the CO2 is coming out of the ocean, but then when the CO2 comes out of the ocean, it starts being the driver of the temperature increase. Well, if that was the case, CO2 would gradually lag temperature. But it isn't the case. The case is that CO2 follows the temperature increase. But here, this is an important point in the history of the Earth. This is the lowest level of CO2 in the history of the Earth, the entire history, 4.6 billion years. It was never lower than this. 180 parts per million. And here, this would be, therefore, 160. Here at 150 plants begin to die from lack of CO2. Because plants just don't need CO2. Like us, we need oxygen, but we can't live at 3% oxygen. We've got 20% oxygen to work with. Plants can't live below 150 ppm. And that's amazing because that's only 0.015% of the atmosphere, and they can get enough CO2 into them under their leaves to live. That's 0.015% of the atmosphere. But that kills them to go lower than that. So here, even though the temperature, I have a graph that shows the temperature going more or less straight across here, which is like it would be about here. The average temperature doesn't change much if you take the average through all this period. But CO2 is just basically, this is when wood was created, when trees evolved. They sucked a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But then it came up again and up again. We don't know why this happened. There's various theories. The paper I wrote on this talks about the various theories. But I am certain that this is virtually all due to marine calcifying organisms. Because whatever the balance is, we know for sure that more CO2 is coming out of the atmosphere than is going back into it again in the carbon cycle. So in other words, to say that the carbon cycle was some kind of miracle natural balance is completely wrong. It was being depleted for 150 million years steadily. Never mind this for a sec. We don't know enough about that far in the past really to make positive statements, but we do know this. 150 million years, getting down to near the death of plants, which is basically the death of life on Earth. And here we come, and this is what we've done. This little uptick here. We have gone from 280 to 400 ppm and saved life on Earth from certain death not many million years from now. And maybe even sooner, depending on just how it went in these next glaciations. But if you just project forward from the trend that has happened for 150 million years, when you cross this red line, in 2 to 4 million years from now, life dies. So our CO2 emissions, like no other species, could have ever gone into the ground and brought the carbon back to the surface and put it back in the atmosphere, drilling down deep into the earth. And even when we make cement, we are returning the calcified organisms back to the atmosphere again. Because you take calcium carbonate, and you make calcium oxide and CO2. So the CO2 is released again. So we have brought a balance back to the global carbon cycle. And we can keep doing that for as long as we want, because we could never drive CO2 up to the levels it was in the past. When life was flourishing, at the time of the dinosaurs, CO2 was over 1,000 ppm. That would be good if we could get it up there. Might be difficult because it's a long way from where we are now. But there is no doubt that this is what was happening. And there's no doubt, and there's no reason to believe that it would have changed that. No reason whatsoever. Not even one. The only thing that has changed is we have come along and started putting some of the carbon back into the air that was taken out of it by life. So when those organisms, those calcium organisms evolved, they basically predicted the end of life. They didn't know it wasn't their fault. And the funny thing is, we didn't know what we were doing either. We were just getting energy. And suddenly you realize that inadvertently we have saved life on Earth from dying so quickly in terms of the geological record. It was not very long. Well, now we can keep the CO2 level in the atmosphere up at a high level for millions of years. Someday, when the fossil fuels are gone, or at least so scarce that there's hardly any left, there will still be this massive amount of calcium carbonate, 100 million billion tons of it. And I bet someday every country will have a quota for how much cement they have to make, or how much calcium oxide they have to make. We might not need that much cement. But you have to burn the slate, the shale, in order to get the CO2. You have to burn the calcium carbonate. So they will burn, and you can do it with solar energy. It's not a problem. So solar energy, burning calcium carbonate, making CO2, will keep the level of CO2 in the global atmosphere as long as human beings are here to do it. And we will prolong life on Earth for millions, or even tens, or even hundreds of millions of years. I do not know how to predict that. I do know this is true. This was done a while ago when CO2 was at about 360 ppm. So this is adding 150, adding 300 ppm, adding 450 ppm in a controlled experiment inside a plastic encasement. And because CO2 is heavier than air, it tends to stay in there. And so it's easy to control the level of CO2 inside it. You don't even need to put a ceiling on it. And so they just control the CO2 level, and all the trees have been given the same soil, same fertilizer, the same water, and that's how fast trees grow. And if you don't know, there's an experimental forest here in Germany where the trees, in many cases, are growing 40 to 70% faster than they normally did before that. They've been monitoring these trees since 1870. And in the 1960s, their growth rate started to increase. The growth rate of individual trees increases a lot, but there's only room for so many trees. So the biomass of the forest is growing faster than before, but not as fast as the individual trees grow. But it's still an amazing number. And this is what spurred me to stop just guessing about CO2 and saying, well, I don't really know what's, I do know. This is the greening of the Earth. This work is done by CSIRO in Australia. And NASA has confirmed this work. It's been reported in National Geographic that the Earth is greening. And the Greens are thinking up every possible way to debunk this, to discredit it, to say it won't be any good, whatever. It's just ridiculous. Look at this Western Australia, one of the driest parts in the world. Western India, the Sahel under the Sahara. The driest places are where the greatest increase in growth is occurring. This is due to the fact that trees are more efficient with water when CO2 goes up, because they produce less stomata, which is where they take the CO2 in, but it's also where they let the oxygen out, and because they're a hole in the leaf, water can come out of there. They need to do that somewhat for transpiration, but because CO2 got so low, they were having to make so many stomata that they were losing water unnecessarily. They didn't need to have that much transpiration. They need some to bring the nutrients up to the leaves with the water that comes from the ground. But now, if you go to the US West, you'll see all these huge grassland areas that were bare of trees, have trees this tall on them now, spread out all over. Craig Inso of CO2 Science, it's a website, has documented this from aerial photography, before and after. So, they say CO2 is a pollutant and it's going to destroy the world and kill half the population or whatever, but this is really what has happened during the CO2 emissions increase. GDP, population, life expectancy. And my statement is that CO2 and fossil fuels that emit the emissions from fossil fuels, that the fossil fuels themselves are the basis of much of our longevity, lifespan, much of our wealth, in order to be able to afford to have a comfortable life, and much of our personal freedom, i.e. the ability to get into a vehicle of some sort and go somewhere. That is because of fossil fuels. The moral case for fossil fuels is a book written by Alex, well, I can't remember his last name. He's an American. He's a young guy. He's just brilliant. He's going places. So there's life expectancy and CO2 emissions since 1800. A strong correlation, indeed a causal relationship. So I will just talk now shortly, sorry to be so lengthy, but I'll talk shortly about energy. The Greens, so-called, are against this, they're against this, they're against this, they're against this, They are in favor of this except for the biomass. They tend to be against using wood as an energy source. And that is about half of that. Globally, wood is the most important renewable energy resource and the most important renewable material resource as a structural element in houses, etc., and furniture. Wood is the most important renewable resource. And yet the Greens favor windmills that are made with non-renewable resources and solar panels that are made with non-renewable resources. How can you run a civilization on half of this? That's the real question. And here is CO2 emissions per capita by country. This is the latest date. It hasn't changed for Germany, that's for sure. Germany is the second highest in the EU. And is this some kind of distinction? Why do the Greens hold Germany up as a shining example of energy and climate policy? Because they have good intentions? There it is. Even Poland is down here somewhere. There it is. Everybody complains about Poland because they do have a lot of coal in their mix, but they're not as wealthy as Germans, so they don't use as much stuff or energy. There's the UK, Italy, Spain, France. Look at France at 5.1, nearly half. And this is including all things, transportation, energy, industry, agriculture, everything is included. And the only reason for France being about half of Germany is nuclear energy. The only reason of any significance. As you can see, since 2009, there has been no significant change in CO2 emissions in Germany. I would like to know the number of euros that have been spent on wind and solar during this period. So you throw it in the ocean, basically. Down a sinkhole, in the toilet, gone. This is what is happening with coal-fired power stations internationally. China is building or plans to build 3,534. Japan is replacing its nuclear with coal and gas. South Korea, they're stalled on their nuclear, even though they're one of the most advanced countries in nuclear energy in the world. They have a fantastic nuclear fleet. Philippines, South Africa, Turkey, EU. China is financing most of the new plants in South Asia and Africa with clean coal plants, with the electrostatic precipitators for SO2, bag houses, and all the modern technology that can make coal plants burn very clean. I'm sure you're doing the same thing here. But it's the CO2 you're worried about, which is in fact clean. Not only that, in fact, it's the most important food for your trees, which are now growing faster because of the CO2. Okay, I'll just let you read that. That's what I believe about solar energy. That's the Philippines. No, sorry, it's Puerto Rico. There's another one in the Philippines. It's not very wise in the tropics where there's hurricanes to put solar in. And it was like 15 years ago when I was in New York on Long Island, and a sustainability officer said to me, and I expected him to go on about wind and solar being the only answer. He said, wind and solar are wealth-destroying technologies. In other words, you could have got a lot more for your money than you get by building wind and solar farms. Not only that, they destabilize the grid, they make it impossible, and it's just absolutely nutso, stupid, crazy, like certifiably so. I predict that these turbines that you have built all over the country will rust where they are. Instead of rest in peace, it will be rust in place. And that would be the best thing that could happen, because they don't have a budget to remove them. And they only have a 20-year lifespan anyways. So that's why they guarantee them a profit for 20 years, because they know they're going to stop. We've just built 50 turbines on the north end of Vancouver Island, and already 50%, and this is just, it's opened 5 years ago, And already 50% of the blades have had to be removed and repaired. It's ridiculous. And this is the part that gets me. I don't know how many of you know of Michael Mearsh, who was with Spiegel or Stern for a long time, and now he's working as a communications person for the Wildlife Organization in Berlin. And he's one of the most brilliant minds in the country, in my estimation. I met him in a beer garden by chance 20 years ago, and we've been close friends ever since. And he is fighting to stop this. And this is happening everywhere where there are wind farms. And these aren't just budgies and little Tweety birds. These are the big predator birds that are being wiped out by these machines. And the green movement doesn't give a damn. They say, oh, well, more birds are killed by cats. You know, that's what they say as an excuse. Actually, I don't think cats should be allowed to go out and kill birds myself. Should be in the house or on a leash or something. My country, Canada, gets 60% of its electricity from hydroelectric. Clean, renewable, inexpensive. That's why almost all the aluminum factories are where there is hydroelectric energy. In Seattle, where Boeing's make its jets out of aluminum, it's all of the dams on the Columbia River. In British Columbia, it's at Kitimat on the coast. It's worth bringing the bauxite all the way from Jamaica if you can find a place to build an aluminum smelter with hydroelectric energy, because it only costs 2 or 4 cents a kilowatt hour to make that power. And it's clean, and it makes a lake. Is there too many lakes in the world? That's what the Greens don't like. They don't like turning a river into a lake. How many more rivers are there than lakes? Like 50 times as many? I don't know, but I know there's no shortage of rivers, really. And there's nothing wrong with lakes. Fish like them, actually. And people go boating on them and catch the fish and build cottages around the shoreline. And here, this is South Korea. You see, they're proud of their nuclear plants in the nuclear industry in South Korea, so they paint them nicely. And inside, the walls are with granite and marble in the places where people go. They make them look nice inside. In North America and Europe, mostly the plants, I've been in a lot of nuclear plants around the world, because I was a representative of the nuclear industry in the United States for 6 years. But they make them look okay. Whereas in the States, they'll be covered in rust, and they don't paint them at all, and they leave the walls just bare concrete inside. Saves money, I guess. But how much money does it cost compared to the price of the nuclear plant to make it look a little nice, so people look at it and say, oh, that looks nice, instead of that looks ugly? Here's new nuclear. China is building right now 25 nuclear plants. India, Russia, these are the 3 main countries going into nuclear, and they represent half the world's population. Japan is still got one under construction, apparently. South Korea is still building a couple, but they're having trouble getting plans for more. But this is what's going on in the world. While Germany plans to shut down 15% of the clean energy that it has and reliable energy that it has today. And the fact is, the so-called waste from the nuclear plants still contains 98% of the energy. If you include the depleted uranium-238, that can all be put back into the fuel cycle by using the plutonium that's created in the reactor to start the U-238 being turned into more plutonium. It's called breeder, or the generic term is fast neutron reactor. And this allows you, and here is Russia's second big fast neutron reactor on the Caspian Sea, the BN800, 800 megawatts. This is used nuclear fuel. It's not nuclear waste. It is fuel that has gone through one cycle, and only 1 to 2% of the energy has been extracted from it. In other words, 50 years worth of nuclear generation on the first cycle equals 5,000 years of energy. This used fuel should be guarded carefully. If I was them, I would put it under a tin roof and control the temperature and the humidity in there so that these casks would last for 300, 400, 500 years. Because if you keep them for 300 years before you recycle the used fuel, all of the really nasty isotopes have decayed. All the strontium-90, all the iodine long before that, all of the cesium-137 will all have decayed to neutral, and all that will be left is the long-lived plutonium and uranium-238. And that can then be used to start another cycle, another cycle, another cycle, another cycle, 98 more cycles. Russia has sold 2 of these to China, so Russia and China will both have fast neutron reactors soon. Many countries have had them, either under construction or operating. The United States shut its down under Clinton in '92. France shut its Phoenix reactor down way back. Japan had one, shut it down. But Russia and China are going ahead with this now. There's no reason to be afraid of these things. Nuclear energy has caused less mortality in the public and in the workforce than any other energy technology. Only Chernobyl killed people. No deaths are attributed to Fukushima. No deaths are attributed to 3 Mile Island. Only Chernobyl, which was a class of reactor that should never been allowed. It's behind the Iron Curtain when the Russians decided to use their weapons, plutonium production reactors, and cookie-cutted them all over to make commercial power. They had a positive void coefficient, which means a runaway nuclear explosion was possible. And while they were doing an experiment, a runaway nuclear explosion happened. The engineers who were doing it wasn't during normal operating hours. The other 3 reactors continued to run there for 14 years. The same class exactly. But that one ran away because the engineers told the operator under orders to shut down the safety system so that it didn't interfere with what they were doing. So it was only 8 seconds from when the critical reaction began until that thing blew sky high and just broke the whole thing to pieces. Nothing like that happened. Those explosions at Fukushima were not nuclear explosions, they were steam explosions. Hydrogen explosions. From the hydrogen being generated from the catalyzation of the cladding, the zirconium cladding of the fuel inside the reactor. So the hydrogen built up in those towers, you remember those wooden glass and wooden towers, they're just basically sheltered. They're not meant to stop an explosion. And they were just covering the reactor. The reactor operators were afraid to let that hydrogen gas out into the atmosphere because it's slightly radioactive. They'd already evacuated everybody from the area. If they had let that gas out, none of those 3 explosions would ever have occurred. Those explosions damaged the reactor even further than the meltdown did. Because like, you know, if you take gasoline and pour it on a fire, the fire comes up the spout into the tank and blows up. Many people have died from this because the gas blows up all over them. In the nuclear reactor, the hydrogen fire that started from any spark, as soon as it reaches 8% of the volume of the air, that hydrogen explosion went right down into the core of that reactor and blew in there too. So they were stupid all the way. They were stupid at the beginning by not having hardened backup power. They had generators on sleds in front of the reactors by the sea that were just swept away by the tsunami. And they had no other backup power, and the whole thing was cut off from energy, and so the pumps couldn't work to cool the core while the core cooled down after they shut them down. That all would have gone like clockwork if the Japanese had listened to the rest of the world about how to design a nuclear reactor. But they're very insular people. Fossil fuels are 100% organic, made with solar energy only. No other form of energy is used to make them. When you burn them, they produce the 2 most important foods for life, CO2 and water. And they are by far the largest storage battery of energy in the world. It has been sequestered by life over time, and now life is unsequestering some of it. That's a simple story. Here's Greenpeace attacking a Russian oil platform with a diesel-powered ship, saying we must end our addiction to oil, and then fueling up with BP diesel fuel at the dock. Some end of addiction to oil. This is where the oil and gas shale deposits are in your part of the world. Note that Germany has a rather large quantity of this. The United States has now become the single largest producer of fossil fuel in the world by country because of this. Meanwhile, you import your gas from Russia and have a security issue, a national security issue as a result of that. You're probably afraid to do anything that embarrasses the Russians. And they have you buy the you-know-whats. So why don't you get with it? Israel is an interesting country, especially today. But Golda Meir, former president of Israel, remarked once, how come we turned out to be the only country in the Middle East with no oil and gas? Right? Well, now they've got gas shared with that island that's just off their coast under Turkey. Cyprus, yes. So they're sharing that, but they've got a huge volume of natural gas now in the sea. And they have this deposit right in the middle of the country, about 1 kilometer deep, vast amount of oil shale. But their Greens won't let them develop it. So they have to buy their oil from Saudi Arabia or somebody like that. But they will do it someday. But if Germany was smart, you would, as you know, the UK is doing it. They're going ahead with fracking. Fracking is absolutely not dangerous. It's so ridiculous. It's just because they don't want you to have fossil fuels that they're against it. It's got nothing to do with it being a dangerous technology. It's being done for 60 years in the States for oil originally, and now for gas. But you just drill a hole down and drill a hole over and put high pressure water and fracture the shale, and the gas comes out and the oil comes out. Simple. And it doesn't hurt anything. And there are your nuclear plants, which will theoretically all be shut in 2021, is it, or 22? 21, yes, it's very soon, actually. Here is your energy consumption pattern on a daily basis and the different fuels that are in it. It is very clear that you need a 70 gigawatt peak base load of power in this country. You've got to have it, or things will stop, or they'll order the factories to close for a day or whatever. It cannot. The thing is, wind and solar cannot fill even 100 watts worth of base power. You cannot rely on it to be there when you need it. It's just not possible to say that. People are acting as though you can rely on it to be there. You can't. Wind is even less predictable than solar. At least we know solar is going to be there in the daytime if it's not cloudy. But we don't know when wind is going to be there. There is more wind at night, it's true, when we don't need it. But the fact is, if Germany shuts down its nuclear plants, there will be no question that the economy will have to shrink. There's no more room to move. As you can see with the CO2 emissions, they've been flat since 2009, nearly 10 years. Nothing that has been done is doing anything to change that. And the only thing you can replace the fossil fuels with, if you want to get rid of fossil fuels, you don't have a lot of hydroelectric potential here like they do in many other countries. You have to go to nuclear. There isn't any choice. So probably the Greens will be happy when the economy shrinks by 15%, and that causes, even then, no CO2 drop in CO2 emissions, because you'll need all the coal and gas plants you have now, at the same time dropping by 15% in your baseload. Anybody who can even do basic arithmetic should understand that. It isn't just going to magically disappear, the 15% that you need. It isn't, you aren't all of a sudden going to be able to use 15% less energy every day than you do now. It just can't happen. There is no solution to that, except to build something else. And nuclear is the obvious answer. Instead, you're going the other direction. That's why I say Germany is like a big ship headed for a very big rock. And unless you turn around and scrap the Energiewende approach, because it isn't working, it hasn't worked, it won't work, and it will destroy the country, that's the only way. So I'm so pleased to be associated with the FDP because of their position here, is the only one in the country that accepts this truth. Both the majority parties are stuck in the green mode on this. Even CDU, which is supposed to be conservative, I thought conservative meant that you were conservative, not radical in what you're doing, but being thoughtful about what you're doing. But no, that even Merkel, who is a scientist, is going with this. You know, so it's just pure politics. And the public has been scared into thinking something is going to happen that is not going to happen. So that's why we should celebrate CO2, right then and there. My book, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, I'm sorry it's only in English, but it is available on Amazon. And this is why we should celebrate CO2. See those little bubbles in the champagne? CO2. Thank you very much.